Nothing cuts deeper than family, turning their backs on you when you need them most. Elias Morrow learned this hard truth when his own children decided he wasn't worth keeping around anymore. They said he was too old-fashioned, too set in his ways. So he packed up his few belongings, called his loyal dog Boone, and headed up to the mountains where nobody could judge him. High up in those peaks, he found an old cabin falling apart. Most folks would have kept walking. But Elias saw something different. He saw a chance to start over. With just his hands and his faithful dog by his side, he began rebuilding that broken-down place. What started as fixing a roof became something much bigger. But what would happen when his family came looking for him after hearing about the paradise he'd created? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elias Morrow had lived 73 years on this earth, and most of those years had been spent with his hands dirty and his back bent to honest work. Born in the shadow of the Rockies when men still trapped beaver and knew the weight of silence, he'd learned early that the mountains didn't care about your feelings, they only respected your effort. His grandfather's rusty axe hung heavy in his weathered hands as he stood before the collapsed cabin, its blade dulled by decades of use, but still solid as the day it was forged. 3 generations of Morrow men had swung this tool, splitting kindling and felling trees, building lives from timber and determination. Now it would build again. The cabin sat in a natural clearing about 8,000 feet up, where the air thinned and the pines grew stubby and determined. Whoever had built it originally knew what they were doing. The foundation stones were still square and level, chosen for their flat faces and fitted tight against the frost. But time and weather had taken their toll. The roof had caved in on the north side, and vines thick as a man's wrist had worked their way between the logs, prying them apart with slow, relentless strength. Boone, his black and tan mutt with one torn ear and eyes wise beyond his 8 years, sniffed around the perimeter with the methodical thoroughness of a creature who'd learned to trust his nose over his eyes. The dog had been with Elias since he was a pup, found half-starved beside a creek during one of their longer trapping expeditions. Now Boone moved with the careful gait of an old companion, his joints stiff on cold mornings, but his loyalty unwavering. "What do you think, old boy?" Elias asked, running his thumb along the axe handle's smooth groove, worn by countless palms. "Reckon we can make something of this mess?" Boone's tail wagged once, a measured response that said he was willing to try if Elias was. The mountains had always been Elias's true home, even when he'd tried to live down in the flatlands with his wife Margaret and their 2 children. He'd worked construction then, building other people's dreams, while his own grew smaller each year. Margaret had wanted him to be practical, to think about retirement and health insurance and all the things that kept regular folks anchored to civilization. She died 6 years ago, cancer, taking her quick and mean. And in those final months, she'd made him promise to stay close to David and Sarah. But promises to the dead get complicated when the living have their own plans. David worked for some computer company in Denver, wore press shirts, and spoke in acronyms that meant nothing to Elias. He lived in a subdivision where all the houses looked the same, and the homeowners association had rules about what color you could paint your mailbox. Sarah had married a banker in Cheyenne and spent her days driving kids to soccer practice and worrying about property values. Both of them looked at their father like he was a relic from another age. Interesting, maybe, but not particularly useful. The final break had come 3 months ago, when David suggested it was time for Elias to move into assisted living. "Dad, you're getting up there," he'd said, not meeting his father's eyes. "What if you fall? What if something happens and nobody's around to help? These places are nice now. They've got activities and everything." Sarah had nodded agreement from across the kitchen table, her manicured fingers folded tight. "We just worry about you, Dad, living alone in that old house so far from everything." But Elias knew worry when he heard it, and this wasn't worry. This was convenience. They wanted him tucked away somewhere safe and manageable, where trained professionals could deal with whatever complications old age might bring. They wanted to visit on Sundays and holidays, to pat his hand and tell themselves they were being good children. He'd listen to their reasons and their research, watch them tag-team him with brochures and statistics. Then he'd stood up from the table where Margaret used to serve Sunday dinner and told them he'd think about it. That night, he'd taken his grandfather's axe down from the mantel and run his fingers along its worn handle. He'd thought about the cabin up in the high country, the one he'd stumbled across during a hunting trip 15 years ago. The place had been abandoned even then, slowly returning to the forest that had birthed it. But the bones were good, and bones were what mattered. Boone had sensed the decision before Elias made it, the way dogs do. He'd started sleeping by the door and watching the windows like he was waiting for something to begin. Now, standing in the thin mountain air with his grandfather's axe and his faithful dog, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in years: possibility. The cabin was a mess, sure enough. Half the roof was gone, and what remained sagged like an old man's shoulders. The chinking between the logs had crumbled away, leaving gaps wide enough for winter wind to howl through. The single window was spiderwebbed with cracks, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. But Elias saw past the damage to the bones beneath. The logs were still sound, real timber, not the engineered lumber they use nowadays. The foundation stones hadn't shifted, which meant the ground was stable. The clearing faced southeast, perfect for catching the morning sun and shedding the afternoon storms that built up over the peaks. He walked the perimeter slowly, Boone trailing behind, cataloguing what needed doing. The roof would have to be completely rebuilt. New rafters, new sheathing, new shingles. He'd need to re-chink the entire cabin, replacing the old mud and moss with proper mortar. The window would have to go, and the door too. Inside, he could see that animals had made themselves at home over the years. Raccoon droppings littered the floor, and something had built a nest in what used to be the fireplace. But none of that daunted him. He'd built plenty of things in his 73 years, and he'd torn down plenty more. Every problem had a solution if you were willing to work at it long enough. The nearest hardware store was 40 miles down a winding mountain road, and the nearest neighbor was probably 20 miles beyond that. Up here, you made do with what you had and fixed what broke. That suited Elias just fine. He'd grown tired of depending on other people anyway. As the sun climbed higher, he began making mental lists. He'd need lumber for the roof, but there were plenty of dead trees within walking distance. His old chainsaw was still running strong, and he had enough gas for now. Nails and screws he'd have to buy, along with proper roofing materials and glass for the window. Maybe some concrete for the chinking, though he remembered his grandfather using a mix of clay and pine pitch that lasted decades. The work would take months, maybe longer. Mountain weather was unpredictable, and he wasn't 20 anymore. But he had time, nothing but time and the quiet satisfaction of working with his hands toward something worthwhile. Boone found a shady spot under one of the surviving pines and settled down to watch his master think. The dog had seen this look before, the way Elias's eyes went distant when he was planning something. Usually, it meant they'd be moving soon, packing up for another hunting trip or heading to some remote creek where the fishing was supposed to be good. This time felt different, though. This time felt permanent. Elias pulled the family photo from his wallet, its edges soft with age and handling. Margaret smiled up at him from the faded image, young and happy with David on her lap and Sarah standing beside her in a white Sunday dress. He'd carried this picture for 23 years, through construction jobs and camping trips and all the ordinary moments that make up a life. His children had been so small then, so eager for his attention. David used to beg to come along on hunting trips, and Sarah would sit in his lap while he read her stories about brave princesses and clever animals. Somewhere along the way, they'd grown up and grown apart, becoming strangers who shared his blood, but not his understanding of what mattered. Maybe that was just the way of things. Maybe every generation had to reject the one that came before in order to find their own path. But it still hurt. standing in this high mountain clearing with only a dog for company and wondering when he'd become someone his own children found embarrassing. He tucked the photo back into his wallet and hefted the axe. Enough thinking. Time to get started. The first step was clearing away the debris, fallen timbers and rotted boards, layers of pine needles and decades of accumulated forest litter. He worked methodically, sorting the salvageable from the hopeless, stacking usable lumber in neat piles and dragging the ruined pieces to a burn pile downwind from the cabin. Boone supervised from his shady spot, occasionally getting up to investigate something interesting, but mostly content to watch his master work. The dog understood about projects. He'd seen Elias fix plenty of broken things over the years, always with the same patient determination that refused to accept defeat. As the afternoon wore on and the debris pile grew smaller, the cabin's true skeleton began to emerge. The logs were solid pine, darkened with age but still sound. Whoever had built this place knew their craft. The notches were cut clean and tight, and the logs had been chosen for straightness and strength. This wasn't some weekend project thrown together by city folks playing at frontier life. This was real building, done by someone who planned to stay. By evening, Elias had cleared enough space to set up his camp inside the cabin walls. He'd brought a good tent and sleeping bag, enough food for several days, and his grandfather's old camp cook stove that still burned steady and hot. Boone curled up beside him as the mountain air turned crisp and the first stars appeared through the gap where the roof used to be. Tomorrow he'd start the real work. Tonight he'd listen to the wind in the pines and remember what it felt like to be exactly where he belonged. The eviction notice had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a nervous young man in a crisp uniform who couldn't meet Elias's eyes when he handed over the envelope. 30 days to vacate the premises. Legal language that boiled down to a simple truth. His own children were throwing him out of the house he'd called home for 43 years. Elias had stood on the front porch, reading the document twice while the delivery man shuffled his feet and apologized for the inconvenience. The paper felt strange in his hands. Too clean, too official for something that was tearing his life apart. At the bottom, he recognized David's careful signature and Sarah's flowing script, both notarized and filed with the county clerk. They'd done their homework, made it all legal and proper. Dad, David's voice had come from behind him, uncertain and defensive. We need to talk. Elias had turned slowly, the notice still in his hands. His son stood in the doorway, wearing one of his pressed work shirts, and the expression of a man trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. Sarah's car was parked in the driveway. She'd driven up from Cheyenne for this conversation, which meant they'd planned it together. Already said your piece. Looks like, Elias replied, holding up the eviction notice. Right here in black and white. It's not an eviction, Dad. It's... David stopped, ran a hand through his thinning hair. Look, we've been trying to talk to you about this for months. You won't listen to reason. Reason. Elias tasted the word like something bitter. That what you call this? Sarah appeared beside her brother, her face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from feeling guilty. We found you a really nice place, Dad. Sunset Manor has an opening. And they specialize in warehousing old folks who've outlived their usefulness. That's not fair. David's voice rose, then caught himself and lowered it again. You're being dramatic. These are good facilities with trained staff and activities. Activities! Elias folded the notice carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Bingo and wheelchair races, I suppose. The conversation had gone downhill from there. David explaining how they'd already paid the first month's rent at Sunset Manor, how they'd arranged for a moving company to handle his belongings, how they'd thought of everything except asking what he wanted. Sarah talking about safety and peace of mind, her voice getting higher and more brittle with each justification. Elias had listened to it all with the patience of a man watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. You couldn't argue with weather, and you couldn't argue with children who'd already made up their minds. They'd convinced themselves this was love, this careful dismantling of his independence, this reduction of his life to what fits safely in a retirement homeroom. The house needs too much work, David had said finally. gesturing at the peeling paint on the porch rail and the loose shingle that had been flapping in the wind for 2 months. The maintenance alone is becoming a full-time job, and you're not what? Not capable? Elias had straightened to his full height, still an inch taller than his son, despite the stoop that had crept into his shoulders. Been taking care of this place since before you were born, son? Reckon I can manage a little longer, but they had legal papers and good intentions and the kind of certainty that comes from never having to depend on anyone else's judgment. The house would be sold, they'd already contacted a realtor, and the proceeds would help pay for his care at Sunset Manor. Everything neat and tidy, and completely out of his hands. That night, after they'd gone back to their respective lives, Elias had sat in Margaret's old rocking chair and looked around the living room she'd decorated with such care. Her quilt still hung on the walls, bright patches of color against the pine paneling. Her books still filled the shelves David claimed were collecting dust. Her presence still lingered in every corner. Every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every family photograph arranged just so on the mantel. Boone had sensed his distress and pressed close against his legs, offering the wordless comfort that only old dogs understand how to give. The eviction notice lay on the coffee table between them, a piece of paper that would change everything, whether Elias wanted it to or not. He tried calling David that evening, thinking maybe they could work something out, some compromise that would let him stay in his own home while addressing their concerns. But David's phone went straight to voicemail, and Sarah didn't answer either. They'd made their decision and delivered it, and now they were avoiding the messy aftermath of actually talking to him about it. The next 3 weeks had passed in a blur of forced preparations. The moving company David had hired showed up to pack his belongings. Efficient strangers who wrapped his life in bubble plastic and loaded it into trucks. They handled Margaret's quilts like they were any other household goods, folded them into boxes with the casual indifference of people who didn't understand what they represented. Elias had saved a few things for himself. Clothes enough for a week, his grandfather's axe, some basic camping gear, and the old photo of his family when they'd still been happy together. Everything else disappeared into storage units and donation centers, sorted by people who saw dollar signs instead of memories. His neighbors had come by to say goodbye, most of them uncomfortable with the whole situation, but not sure how to help. Mrs. Patterson from next door had brought a casserole and tears in her eyes. "It's not right," she'd whispered, looking around the empty living room. "This is your home." But right and wrong didn't seem to matter much when lawyers and good intentions got involved. The morning of his departure, Elias had walked through the empty house one last time. The rooms echoed strangely without furniture to absorb sound, and his footsteps seemed too loud on the hardwood floors Margaret had insisted on refinishing 10 years ago. Sunlight streamed through windows that would soon belong to someone else, illuminating dust motes and memories with equal indifference. In the kitchen, he'd run his hand along the counter where Margaret used to roll out pie crusts every Sunday. The scratches and stains told the story of 40 years of family meals, homework sessions, and quiet conversations over morning coffee. Soon enough, new owners would renovate it all away, replacing his history with their own. Boone had followed him through the house, tail low and confused by the absence of familiar smells. Dogs understood homes differently than people. They knew them by scent and routine, by the comfortable patterns of daily life. All of that was gone now, erased as efficiently as David had erased his father's choices. Outside, Elias loaded his few possessions into the old pickup truck that had served him faithfully for 15 years. David had suggested he sell it too. What would he need a truck for in assisted living? But Elias had kept the keys and the title. A man needed some way to move through the world on his own terms. Even if those terms were getting narrower by the year, the drive to Sunset Manor had taken 20 minutes through streets that seemed smaller and sadder than he remembered. David and Sarah were waiting in the parking lot, looking relieved that he'd shown up voluntarily. They'd probably worried he might make a scene, refused to go quietly into the good night they'd planned for him, But Elias had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, not because you couldn't win, but because winning would cost more than losing. His children thought they were protecting him, and maybe that counted for something, even if their protection felt like a cage. The tour of his new home had been mercifully brief. A small room with a narrow bed and a view of the parking lot. A common area where residents played cards and watched television programs chosen by committee. A dining room that served meals at fixed times, whether you were hungry or not. Everything clean and safe and utterly foreign to a man who'd spent his life making his own decisions. "You'll like it here, Dad," Sarah had said, squeezing his arm with desperate hope. "Mrs. Rodriguez in 4B used to be married to a rancher. You'll have lots in common." Elias had nodded and signed the papers and listened to the staff explain the rules about visiting hours and meal times and which activities were mandatory for his own good. Then he'd hugged his children goodbye and watched them drive away, probably already feeling better about themselves for solving the problem of their difficult father. That first night at Sunset Manor, lying in a bed that smelled like industrial disinfectant and listening to the artificial quiet of a place where real life had been carefully filtered out, Elias had made his decision. Boone was staying at a kennel until arrangements could be made. Another problem for David and Sarah to solve, but not for long. By morning, Elias Morrow would be gone, and the mountains would be waiting. Elias had slipped out of Sunset Manor before dawn, moving through the sterile hallways like a ghost escaping his own funeral. The night security guard was dozing at his desk, and the electronic locks that were supposed to keep residents safe had proven surprisingly easy to bypass when you'd spent a lifetime figuring out how things worked. He'd left a note on his pillow, just his name and the words "gone fishing," because disappearing completely seemed cruel even when you'd been wronged. The drive to the kennel had taken 40 minutes, through empty streets, past the closed shops and darkened houses of people still sleeping in their proper beds. Boone had been waiting in the concrete run, like he'd known this moment was coming, tail wagging with the kind of joy that only dogs could manage after 3 days of confusion and abandonment. The kennel staff wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, but Elias had experience with simple locks and a lifetime of making do. Now, 3 days into their mountain exile, man and dog had fallen into the rhythm of real work. Elias woke with the sun filtering through the gaps in the cabin walls, boiled coffee on his camp stove, and spent the daylight hours learning the mountain's moods while planning his assault on decades of neglect. The old leather-bound journal had belonged to the cabin's original builder, tucked away in a rusted coffee can behind what remained of the stone fireplace. Its pages were yellow and brittle, some stuck together with moisture and time. But enough remained readable to tell the story of a man named Samuel Garrett, who'd built this place in 1924 with nothing but hand tools and determination. The journal entries revealed a kindred spirit, a man who'd come to the mountains, not running from something, but running toward the kind of life that made sense to him. Garrett had documented everything: which trees made the best building timber, where to find clay for chinking, how to position the cabin to catch winter sun and shed summer storms. More importantly, he'd written about the deeper satisfaction of creating something lasting with your own hands. June 15th, 1924, one entry read in faded ink. Finished setting the foundation stones today. Took near 2 weeks to find ones that fit just right, but a house is only as good as what it stands on. A man's the same way, I reckon. Elias found himself nodding as he read by firelight each evening, recognizing a philosophy he'd lived by but never articulated so clearly. Garrett had understood what David and Sarah couldn't, that some kinds of security couldn't be bought or guaranteed by institutions. Real security came from knowing you could take care of yourself, from building something that would outlast the person who built it. The journal entries spanned 3 years, chronicling the slow transformation of wilderness into home. Garrett had been methodical, working through each season and learning what the mountain demanded of him. He'd made mistakes, a roof pitch too steep for the local snow load, chinking that cracked in the first hard freeze, but he'd learned from each failure and built better. The final entry was dated September 23rd, 1927. Winter coming early this year. Cabins ready for whatever weather brings. A man could live good up here if he's willing to work for it. Going down to town for supplies. Be back before the first snow. But Samuel Garrett had never come back, according to the county records Elias had researched years ago during his first visit to this place. Some said he'd gotten caught in an early blizzard on the trail down. Others claimed he'd simply decided to start over somewhere else, the way men did in those days when the world was bigger and disappearing was easier. Either way, his cabin had waited in the mountains for nearly a century, slowly returning to the forest that had birthed it. Now it would have a second chance. Elias had started with the roof, because everything else depended on keeping the weather out. The old rafters were mostly sound. Garrett had chosen his timber well, but the sheathing and shingles were beyond salvation. Working alone with his grandfather's axe and a borrowed chainsaw, Elias had spent 2 days selecting and felling dead trees within a reasonable distance of the cabin. The work was harder than he'd expected. Not just the physical labor, though 73-year-old muscles reminded him daily that he wasn't young anymore, but the problem-solving that came with working alone in a place where the nearest hardware store might as well have been on the moon. Every decision had consequences that wouldn't become apparent until later, and there was no one to catch his mistakes except himself. But there was satisfaction in it too, the kind of deep pleasure that came from seeing immediate results from honest effort. Each rafter he shaped and fitted brought the cabin one step closer to being whole again. Each bundle of shingles he split from good cedar brought him one step closer to a roof that would shed rain instead of inviting it in. Boone had appointed himself job supervisor, finding shady spots where he could watch his master work while keeping an eye on the surrounding forest. The dog had adapted to mountain life with the easy grace of an animal whose ancestors had known wilderness intimately. He'd learned which sounds meant attention, the crack of a breaking branch, the distant bugle of an elk, and which were just the ordinary music of wind in the pines. They'd had visitors, though none of the human variety. A black bear had wandered through their camp the second night, investigating the smell of bacon and coffee with the casual boldness of an animal that rarely encountered people. Elias had watched from inside his tent as the bear methodically explored their belongings, finally settling on Boone's water bowl as the most interesting discovery. The dog had remained perfectly still beside his master, understanding that some negotiations were better left to the professionals. A family of mule deer had claimed the meadow below the cabin as their evening feeding ground, appearing each day around sunset to graze among the wildflowers while keeping one ear turned toward the strange sounds coming from the construction site above. The doe was heavy with fawn, moving with the careful grace of expectant mothers everywhere, while her mate browsed nearby with the alert patience of a creature responsible for more than himself. Ravens had begun visiting too, drawn by curiosity about the human activity and the possibility that construction meant food scraps. They watched Elias work from the tops of nearby pines, commenting in their harsh voices about his techniques and progress. He'd taken to saving them small portions of his meals, not because he needed their approval, but because the mountains felt less empty with other creatures sharing his project. The weather had been cooperative so far, warm days and cool nights with enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes manageable. But Elias knew mountain weather could change without warning, and he'd been watching the western horizon each afternoon for the build-up of thunderheads that could bring everything from brief showers to tree-splitting lightning. The forecast meant nothing up here, where weather made its own rules. According to elevation and terrain features no meteorologist could account for. Each morning brought new challenges and small victories. A rafter that fit perfectly on the first try. A section of log wall that proved more solid than it looked. A discovery of where Garrett had hidden his cache of hand-forged nails, still sharp and useful after nearly a century. Progress was slow but steady, measured in feet rather than miles, in problems solved rather than problems avoided. And each evening, as Elias cooked simple meals over his camp stove and read more of Samuel Garrett's journal by firelight, he felt something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize: the deep satisfaction that came from spending your days on work that mattered, in a place where your efforts weren't subject to committee approval or institutional oversight. For the first time in months, Elias Morrow was exactly where he belonged. The handmade copper wind vane had been Elias's first real discovery in Samuel Garrett's hidden workshop, tucked away in a natural cave about 50 yards behind the cabin. Shaped like a running elk with its antlers thrown back, the weathered metal still caught sunlight and spun freely on its ancient mounting. Garrett had been more than just a builder. He'd been an artist who understood that a home needed beauty as much as it needed walls. The workshop cave had probably saved Elias weeks of work. Garrett had been a collector and a planner, stashing away everything from hand-forged nails to carefully selected stones for future projects. Wooden shelves carved directly into the rock held mason jars full of screws and bolts, coffee cans stuffed with wire and small tools, and bundles of materials wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept them dry for decades. More importantly, the cave contained Garrett's detailed drawings for improvements he'd never had the chance to make, a proper chimney design that would draw better than the simple opening he'd started with, plans for extending the cabin's single room into a proper two-room layout, and sketches for a covered porch that would keep firewood dry and provide shelter during storms. Elias had spent an entire morning studying those drawings, recognizing the careful thought behind each modification. Garrett had lived in this place long enough to understand its weaknesses, and his proposed solutions showed the kind of practical wisdom that only came from daily experience with a building's quirks and needs. The wind vane now sat on Elias's makeshift workbench, waiting for the moment when the roof would be finished enough to mount it properly. He'd cleaned away nearly a century of tarnish and bent the elk's front legs back into their original graceful curve. When the work was done, Samuel Garrett's creation would spin again in the mountain wind, showing weather directions to another generation of mountain dweller. By the end of his first week, Elias had fallen into a routine that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced since Margaret's death. Up with the sun, coffee and breakfast while watching the morning light creep down the mountainsides, then work until the heat of afternoon forced him to seek shade. The evening hours were for planning tomorrow's tasks, reading more of Garrett's journal, and listening to the mountain's version of evening news, the calls of coyotes, the splash of beaver in the creek below, the rustle of wind through pine needles. Boone had claimed his own territory around the construction site, establishing a network of favorite napping spots that gave him clear views of both his master and the approaches to their camp. The dog had appointed himself early warning system for anything unusual, from curious chipmunks to the occasional aircraft passing overhead. His presence was a comfort during the long working hours, an essential companionship during the quiet evenings when the silence might otherwise have felt overwhelming. The roof was taking shape faster than Elias had dared hope. The new rafters were straight and strong, cut from beetle-kill pine that had seasoned naturally on the mountainside. He'd learned to read the grain and choose each piece for its intended purpose: lighter wood for the ridge beam, denser pieces for the rafters that would bear the most weight. Working with hand tools forced him to think ahead, to measure twice and cut once, to remember skills he'd thought were buried under decades of power tool convenience. The shingles were another matter entirely. Garrett had used hand-split cedar shakes, each one shaped with an axe and draw knife to lie flat against its neighbors. Making them was slow work that required patience and a feel for how wood wanted to split along its natural grain. Elias found himself falling into the meditative rhythm of the work, shaping piece after piece while his mind wandered through memories and plans. He'd started talking to Boone during the long working hours, not because he was lonely, but because the dog was an excellent listener who never interrupted with unwanted advice. "See there, old boy," he'd say while fitting a particularly tricky rafter. "Garrett knew what he was doing when he cut this notch. It's like it was made for this exact spot," which I suppose it was. Boone would wag his tail and settle back into whatever patch of shade he'd claimed, content to be included in the conversation, even if his contributions were mostly non-verbal. The physical work was demanding in ways Elias had forgotten. His hands developed new calluses, while old ones reappeared after years of soft living. His back ached each morning until movement worked out the kinks, and his shoulders reminded him daily that lifting and fitting timbers was a young man's game. But there was satisfaction in the soreness, proof that his body was still capable of useful work, despite what his children believed about his declining capacities. More challenging than the physical demands were the technical problems that arose with frustrating regularity. The roof pitch that looked right on paper didn't match the reality of the existing walls. A rafter that seemed perfectly cut would reveal a slight twist when he tried to fit it into place. The weather would turn just as he needed to work on something that couldn't get wet, forcing him to rethink his schedule and find indoor tasks. Each problem required creative solutions using only the materials at hand. When he discovered that one wall had settled slightly out of square over the decades, he couldn't simply order a replacement beam or hire someone to jack it back into position. Instead, he had to figure out how to work with the imperfection, cutting new pieces to match the reality of what was, rather than the ideal of what should be. The isolation that had worried David and Sarah proved to be one of the project's greatest strengths. With no schedule to keep except his own, Elias could take the time each job actually required, rather than rushing to meet artificial deadlines. When a task proved more complicated than expected, he could step back and think it through properly, instead of forcing a solution that might cause problems later. He'd made one trip down the mountain for supplies, driving the winding roads to the nearest town with a hardware store worthy of the name. The proprietor, a weathered man named Kellerman, who'd been selling nails and lumber for 40 years, had listened to Elias's list with the attention of someone who understood that mountain projects required careful planning. "Building up in the high country?" Kellerman had asked, tallying up the order. "Haven't had anyone serious about that kind of work in years. Most folks want to build closer to town where the utilities run." Elias had nodded, loading bags of concrete and bundles of roofing materials into his truck. "Sometimes a man needs to get away from utilities for a while." Kellerman had grinned at that, the expression of someone who'd heard similar sentiments from other mountain dwellers over the years. "You need anything else? Don't hesitate to ask. We've been outfitting folks like you since my daddy opened this place. Know what works up there and what doesn't." The drive back up the mountain had been pure pleasure, the truck loaded with everything needed for the next phase of work. Elias had taken his time on the winding road, windows down, and Boone riding shotgun with his nose into the wind. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt like he was heading home, rather than just going somewhere he had to be. The hand-carved wooden cross had been Margaret's, worn smooth by decades of handling during evening prayers and moments of quiet worry. Elias had found it in his shirt pocket the morning after his escape from Sunset Manor, placed there by habit during the hurried packing of his few personal belongings. Now it sat on the windowsill of the slowly recovering cabin, catching morning light through glass he'd installed just 3 days ago. Margaret would have loved this place, he thought, as he watched the sunrise paint the eastern peaks in shades of rose and gold. She'd always talked about retiring to somewhere quiet, somewhere they could sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the world slow down to a pace that made sense. But there had always been reasons to wait. David's college tuition, Sarah's wedding, the mortgage that seemed to regenerate itself every time they thought they were getting ahead. Now 2 weeks into July, the cabin was beginning to look like something that could shelter a man through winter. The roof was finished, and proved watertight during the thunderstorms that rolled through most afternoons. The new window faced southeast to catch the morning sun, and he'd hung shutters that could be closed against the wind when weather turned serious. Inside, he'd built a proper bed frame from pine logs and strung it with rope in the old style, creating a sleeping platform that was comfortable and raised off the cold floor. But the work had been harder on him than he'd expected. His left knee, the one he'd injured in a construction accident 20 years ago, had begun sending sharp reminders of its fragility during the long days of climbing and lifting. His hands, despite their renewed calluses, ached in the cold mountain mornings with the kind of deep soreness that spoke of joints wearing down after 7 decades of use. Still, he pressed on. The alternative, admitting defeat and returning to the sterile safety of assisted living, was unthinkable. Better to work until his body gave out completely than to surrender what remained of his independence to well-meaning children who saw him as a problem to be managed rather than a man with his own dreams. The visitors had started showing up during his 3rd week on the mountain. First had been Tom Brennan, a retired Forest Service ranger who lived about 10 miles down the valley. He'd hiked up one morning with his own dog, a border collie named Scout, who immediately established a complicated territorial negotiation with Boone while the humans talked. "Heard somebody was fixing up old Garrett's place," Tom had said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling onto the log Elias had positioned as a bench outside the cabin door. "Been wondering when someone would take it on. Good bones in that building." Tom had known Samuel Garrett's story better than the county records, how he'd been a surveyor for the railroad before deciding civilization was getting too crowded for his taste, how he'd picked this spot after spending a full year exploring the high country, looking for the perfect combination of shelter, water, and southern exposure, how he'd disappeared one autumn day and never been seen again, though some claimed they'd spotted him years later working as a trapper up in Canada. "Built this place to last," Tom had observed, running his hand along the cabin's newly chinked walls. Of course, he had help from time to time. Mountain folks used to look after each other more than they do now. Lot of hands went into raising these walls. The conversation had revealed something Elias hadn't considered, that his project was being watched by other mountain dwellers who remembered when this kind of building was common, when men regularly disappeared into the high country to create lives that made sense to them. He wasn't quite as alone as he'd thought. Word had spread through the informal network that connected the scattered residents of the high valleys. A week after Tom's visit, an elderly woman named Rose Martinez had arrived with a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden and stories about her late husband's friendship with various hermits and mountain men over the years. Luis always said a man who could build something beautiful in a hard place was worth knowing, she'd told Elias, while admiring his work on the cabin's exterior. Said it took a special kind of stubbornness to make a life up here, the good kind of stubbornness that doesn't bend when it should stand. Rose had insisted on cooking them both lunch over his camp stove, creating a meal that tasted like civilization from vegetables that had grown in mountain soil. She'd brought news from the outside world too, nothing urgent, just the ordinary progress of lives being lived in the valleys below. Her grandson was getting married in the fall. The Murphy family had lost their barn to lightning, but neighbors were helping rebuild it. Small news, but it connected him to a community he'd forgotten existed. The 3rd visitor had been unexpected, a young man named Jake Peterson, who worked as a carpenter in the valley town and had heard about the project through Tom Brennan. Jake had climbed up on a Saturday morning with a toolbox and an offer to help with anything that required more than 2 hands. "Don't get many chances to work on something like this," Jake had explained while examining Elias's notchwork with professional appreciation. "Everything down in town is tract housing and cookie-cutter additions. This is real building, the kind my grandfather used to do." Jake had spent the day helping Elias install the heavy ridge beam that would support the roof's peak, a job that would have taken Elias days to accomplish alone and might have injured him in the attempt. In return, Elias had shared some of the old techniques he'd learned from his own grandfather: how to read the grain in a piece of timber, how to cut a notch that would tighten rather than loosen as the wood aged, how to work with wood's natural tendencies instead of fighting them. "They don't teach this stuff in trade school," Jake had said, practicing the draw-knife technique Elias had shown him for shaping shingles. "It's all power tools and production schedules. Nobody takes time to do things the way they'll last." The young man's enthusiasm had been infectious, reminding Elias of his own early years when every project was a chance to learn something new. Jake had promised to return the following weekend and to bring a friend who was interested in traditional building techniques. But the visitors also brought news that worried him. David and Sarah had been asking questions in town, showing his picture and describing him as a missing person who might be confused or suffering from early dementia. They'd contacted the sheriff's office and filed a missing person report, though Tom Brennan had assured him that Sheriff Patterson was a reasonable man who understood that adults had the right to disappear if they weren't breaking any laws. "Your kids are scared," Rose Martinez had told him gently. "Doesn't make them right, but it makes them human. Maybe you should think about letting them know you're all right, even if you don't want to tell them where you are." The suggestion had merit, but Elias wasn't ready for that conversation yet. He needed more time to prove to himself that this new life was sustainable, that he could actually make it through a mountain winter in the cabin he was building. Until then, any contact with David and Sarah would just provide them with more ammunition for their arguments about his declining capacity and need for supervised care. As the days shortened and the nights grew cooler, Elias found himself working with increased urgency. The cabin needed to be fully winterized before the first serious snow, which could come as early as September at this elevation. That meant finishing the chinking, installing a proper door, and building the improved fireplace that Garrett's drawings had detailed. But there was satisfaction in the approaching deadline. The way mountain weather imposed its own schedule that couldn't be negotiated or postponed. Winter would come whether he was ready or not, and he intended to be ready. The sheriff's badge felt heavier than it should have when Tom Patterson climbed the steep trail to Elias's cabin on a crisp August morning. He'd known this conversation was coming ever since the Morrow children had shown up at his office with their missing person report and their barely concealed frustration at his lack of immediate action. The hand-forged star pinned to his shirt had been his father's before him, passed down along with the understanding that sometimes the law was less important than doing what was right. Patterson found Elias splitting kindling behind the cabin, working with the steady rhythm of a man who'd done this task 10,000 times before. Boone announced the visitor's approach with a single bark, then settled back into his supervisory position once he recognized the familiar scent of someone who belonged in these mountains. "Morning, Elias," Patterson called out, careful to keep his voice casual and his hands visible. "Mind if I have a look at what you've been building up here?" Elias straightened slowly, setting his axe aside with deliberate care. "Morning, Tom. I suppose this isn't a social call." "Partly it is," Patterson replied, genuinely admiring the transformation that had taken place since his last visit to this spot 15 years ago. "This is fine work. Garrett would be pleased to see his place coming back to life." The cabin looked completely different from the ruin Elias had found 6 weeks earlier. The new roof shed water cleanly, and the restored walls stood straight and strong. Window boxes that hadn't been there before held wildflowers Rose Martinez had transplanted from her garden. A covered porch provided shelter for firewood and tools, and the whole structure had the settled look of a place that belonged to its surroundings. "Your kids are worried sick," Patterson continued, accepting the cup of coffee Elias offered from his camp pot. "Filed a missing person report 3 weeks ago. Been asking everyone in the valley if they've seen you." "I'm not missing," Elias replied, settling onto his log bench. "I'm exactly where I want to be. I know that, and you know that. But the law doesn't much care what we know if family members are claiming you're not competent to make your own decisions." Patterson sipped his coffee and chose his words carefully. They're talking about having you declared mentally incompetent. Say you're showing signs of dementia and paranoid delusions. The words hit Elias like cold water. He'd expected his children to be angry about his disappearance, but he hadn't anticipated this level of legal maneuvering. Declaring him mentally incompetent would strip away what remained of his rights as an adult, making him a ward of the state or his children's custody, regardless of his actual mental condition. Do I seem incompetent to you, Tom? Patterson looked around at the expertly restored cabin, the carefully planned layout of tools and materials, the obvious evidence of sustained, intelligent effort. Not to me, you don't. But I'm not a judge, and I'm not a psychiatrist. The Morrows have already consulted with both. The badge on Patterson's chest caught the morning sunlight as he shifted position, a reminder that this conversation had official weight despite its friendly tone. Elias understood the sheriff's position, caught between his personal respect for a man's right to live as he chose and his legal obligation to investigate reports of endangered persons. They want me to bring you in for a competency evaluation, Patterson continued. Court-ordered psychiatric assessment, the whole 9 yards. Say it's for your own safety, and if I refuse, then I have to decide whether to arrest you for your own protection or tell 2 very upset adult children that their father has the right to disappear if he wants to. Patterson's expression suggested he'd already made that decision but wasn't happy about the choice. Thing is, they've got lawyers now, high-powered types from Denver who specialize in elder law. They're not going to let this drop. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. The simple life he'd been building, the peace he'd found in honest work and mountain silence, was about to be complicated by the same forces that had driven him here in the first place. His children's well-meaning efforts to protect him would destroy the very thing that was healing him. How long do I have? They're pushing for immediate action, but I've been dragging my feet. Told them I needed time to investigate, make sure you weren't lying dead in a ditch somewhere. Patterson grinned without humor. Of course, now I've found you alive and well, so that excuse won't work much longer. Maybe a week, 2 at the outside before I have to do something official. After that, it's out of my hands and into the courts. Boone had wandered over during their conversation, sensing the tension between the 2 men and offering his silent support by pressing against Elias's leg. The dog's presence was comforting, a reminder that some relationships didn't require legal documentation or family approval. There is one thing, Patterson added after a long pause. If you could show them you're not just hiding out up here, if you had some kind of plan, some way to prove you're thinking clearly about your future, it might help. Judges don't like breaking up families, but they also don't like taking away people's rights without good cause. The suggestion planted a seed in Elias's mind. He'd been thinking day by day, focused on the immediate challenges of making the cabin livable before winter. But perhaps it was time to think longer term, to create something that would demonstrate his competence and planning ability in terms even lawyers could understand. I appreciate the warning, Tom, and I appreciate you taking your time with this. Your father was a good man, Patterson replied, standing and adjusting his belt. Helped my family through some hard times when I was a kid. Figure I owe him the courtesy of making sure his son gets a fair shake. After the sheriff left, Elias sat on his porch and thought about the conversation while Boone explored the perimeter of their territory. The peaceful morning had been disrupted by the intrusion of outside complications, but maybe that was inevitable. You couldn't escape the world completely, even in the mountains. Eventually, the world found ways to reach you, but he wasn't the same man who'd been escorted to Sunset Manor 2 months ago. The daily work of restoration had restored something in him too. Confidence, purpose, the deep satisfaction that came from building something that would last. His hands were stronger, his mind clearer, his sense of himself more solid than it had been in years. If David and Sarah wanted a fight, he'd give them one. But it would be on his terms, in his place, with the evidence of his competence standing solid around him. The cabin was more than shelter now. It was proof that Elias Morrow still had plenty of building left in him. The badge Tom Patterson wore represented the intersection of law and justice, but sometimes those two things pointed in different directions. Elias hoped the sheriff would remember that when the time came to choose between legal obligations and doing what was right. As the afternoon heat built up, Elias returned to his work with renewed intensity. Every board he fit, every nail he drove, every improvement he made to Samuel Garrett's legacy was also an argument for his own competence and right to self-determination. By winter, this place would be undeniably the home of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. The manila envelope arrived with Jake Peterson when he climbed up for his promised weekend visit, carried in his backpack alongside sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. The young carpenter's expression was troubled as he handed it over, clearly uncomfortable with the role of messenger he'd been asked to play. "Sheriff Patterson asked me to bring this up," Jake explained, avoiding Elias's eyes. "Said it was important you see it before anyone else showed up." Inside the envelope, Elias found copies of documents that made his blood run cold. Medical records from Margaret's final months, death certificates, insurance paperwork, and most devastating of all, a psychiatric evaluation of him dated just 2 weeks after Margaret's funeral. The assessment painted a picture of a man in severe psychological decline, suffering from grief-induced depression, paranoid ideation, and early signs of dementia. Dr. Wesley Hoffman, the psychiatrist David had consulted without Elias's knowledge, had interviewed David and Sarah extensively about their father's behavior following their mother's death. Their concerns about his isolation, his refusal to consider practical living arrangements, his irrational attachment to the old house and outdated lifestyle were all documented in clinical language that made normal grief sound like mental illness, but it was the final page that truly shook Elias to his core. A handwritten letter from Margaret, written during her final weeks when the cancer had made writing painful, tucked into the medical files where David had apparently forgotten about it. The letter was addressed to Elias, and its contents revealed a truth that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about his children's motivations. "My dearest Elias," the letter began in Margaret's careful script, weakened by illness but still unmistakably hers. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll be facing the hardest part of your life alone. I know our children love you, but I also know they don't understand you the way I do. They see your independence as stubbornness, your self-reliance as recklessness. They're going to try to take care of you the way they think is best, but I need you to know I don't want that for you." The letter continued for 2 pages, Margaret's final gift to her husband. She'd known their children would try to control his life after her death, and she'd written specific instructions about what she wanted for him. She wanted him to stay in the mountains he loved, to continue the outdoor life that had made him happiest, to ignore well-meaning family members who would try to cage him in the name of safety. "You taught me that some things are worth more than comfort," the letter concluded. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise now. Find your mountains, my love. Build something beautiful there, and know that wherever you are, if you're being true to yourself, you're exactly where I want you to be." But the most shocking revelation was in the psychiatric report itself. Dr. Hoffman had never actually examined Elias. The entire assessment was based on second-hand reports from David and Sarah, supplemented by their interpretation of his behavior and their assumptions about what constituted normal grieving. The evaluation was professionally written and thoroughly documented, but it was based entirely on the observations of 2 people who had already decided their father needed institutional care. Jake had settled onto the log bench while Elias read, clearly aware that the envelope contained more than routine paperwork. "Sheriff thought you should know what you're up against," he said quietly. "Sounds like they're planning to use that report to have you declared incompetent whether you cooperate or not." Elias felt a mixture of rage and betrayal that threatened to overwhelm his usual calm. His own children had subjected him to psychiatric evaluation without his knowledge or consent, then used the results to justify stripping away his autonomy. Even worse, they'd hidden Margaret's letter, her final wishes for his life, because those wishes contradicted their own plans for his future. "There's more," Jake continued reluctantly. "Sheriff got word that they're planning to come up here Monday with a court order and a medical transport team. They're not taking any chances on you running again. 3 days. Elias had 3 days before his carefully rebuilt life would be dismantled by people who thought they knew what was best for him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 6 weeks proving his competence through skilled work and careful planning, only to discover that the game had been rigged from the beginning. But Margaret's letter changed everything. Hidden in those medical files was proof that his late wife had understood exactly what he needed and had given her explicit blessing for the life he was trying to build. More than that, she'd anticipated his children's well-meaning interference and had tried to protect him from it. "Jake," Elias said slowly, his mind already working through possibilities, "how do you feel about spending a long weekend up here? I'm going to need help with a project that can't wait." The young carpenter grinned, recognizing the tone of a man who'd found his fighting spirit. "What kind of project?" "The kind that proves an old man still knows how to build something that matters." Over the next hour, Elias outlined his plan. If David and Sarah wanted to challenge his competence, he'd give them evidence they couldn't ignore. But first, he needed to create something that would demonstrate not just his building skills, but his ability to think ahead, plan for contingencies, and create systems that would sustain him through whatever challenges mountain living might bring. The next 3 days would determine whether Elias Morrow continued to live as a free man in the mountains he loved, or spent his remaining years as a ward of the system his children thought would keep him safe. But he wouldn't face that challenge passively. If this was to be his last stand, he'd make it count. Jake had brought more than just the envelope. He'd brought tools, materials, and the enthusiasm of a young craftsman eager to help create something extraordinary. Together, they would build more than just improvements to an old cabin. They would build a statement about what it meant to live with dignity and purpose, regardless of age or family expectations. "You know they'll try to tear this down if they win," Jake warned as they began gathering materials for the intensive building session ahead. "Might just be making work for the demolition crew." Elias hefted his grandfather's axe, its weight familiar and reassuring in his hands. "Then we better build it so well that tearing it down would be a crime against craftsmanship." The manila envelope sat on his workbench, its contents having transformed his understanding of the battle ahead. He wasn't just fighting for his right to live alone in the mountains. He was honoring his late wife's final wishes while proving that competence couldn't be measured by psychiatric reports written by doctors who'd never met their subjects. Margaret had trusted him to find his own way, to build something beautiful in a hard place. Now he had 3 days to show the world that her trust had been well placed. The mountain wind picked up as evening approached, rattling the loose papers and setting Samuel Garrett's restored wind vane spinning on the cabin's roof. The copper elk caught the last light of day, its antlers thrown back in eternal motion, a testament to one man's artistic vision preserved across nearly a century. Tomorrow, Elias would begin building his own testament, something that would endure long after the lawyers and psychiatrists had moved on to other cases. Something that would prove an old man's right to live and die on his own terms in the place that made sense to him. The manila envelope had brought devastating news, but it had also brought Margaret's blessing and the clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you're fighting for. Sometimes the worst news carries the seeds of the best solutions if you're strong enough to plant them and wise enough to tend them properly. The camp lantern burned through the night as Elias and Jake worked by its steady light, transforming 3 days of desperate inspiration into the most ambitious building project either man had ever attempted. The hand-forged iron hinges that would anchor their creation had been discovered in Samuel Garrett's workshop cave, wrapped in oiled leather and waiting nearly a century for their intended purpose. Each hinge was a work of art, shaped, by a blacksmith who understood that functional beauty was the highest form of craftsmanship. Saturday morning found them framing what would become a combination workshop and library, extending from the cabin's south wall with the kind of architectural integration that made additions look like original design. But this wasn't just about adding space, it was about creating a comprehensive demonstration of sustainable mountain living that would prove Elias's competence beyond any reasonable doubt. My grandfather always said a man's workshop tells you everything you need to know about his mind. Elias explained while Jake helped him set the corner posts. Organized tools mean organized thinking. Quality work means quality judgment. A place for everything, and everything in its place. The workshop design incorporated every principle of mountain self-sufficiency Elias had learned over 7 decades of outdoor living. Solar panels salvaged from a failed research station would provide electricity for basic lighting and radio communication. A rainwater collection system would supplement the spring that fed the cabin. Root cellars carved into the hillside would store food through the winter months. Each system was designed to work independently or in coordination with the others, creating redundancy that would keep a mountain dweller safe even when individual components failed. Jake had proven to be more than just an enthusiastic helper. He was a craftsman with an intuitive understanding of how structures should fit together. His modern carpentry training combined with Elias's traditional techniques created hybrid solutions that honored old methods while incorporating contemporary improvements. The young man's energy complemented Elias's experience, making possible in 3 days what would have taken either of them weeks working alone. This is going to be something special, Jake said, stepping back to admire the workshop's emerging frame. When word gets out about what you've built up here, folks are going to come from all over to see it. But Elias knew they were building against time as much as against the mountain weather. Every hour brought Monday's confrontation closer, and with it the legal machinery his children had set in motion. The psychiatric evaluation in that manila envelope was like a loaded gun pointed at his independence, and he needed to create enough evidence of his competence to make using it seem ridiculous. Rose Martinez arrived Sunday morning with a basket of food and news from the valley below. David and Sarah had been spotted in town Saturday night, staying at the Mountain Inn and asking detailed questions about access roads to the high country. They'd brought reinforcements, men in suits who looked like lawyers and a woman who claimed to be a medical professional, qualified to assess elderly patients in crisis situations. They're not planning to take no for an answer, Rose warned, while helping to organize the workshop's tool storage systems. Tom Patterson's doing what he can to slow them down, but there's only so much a county sheriff can do when people come armed with court orders. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on any of them. While Elias worked frantically to prove his mental competence through skilled craftsmanship and intelligent planning, his children were preparing to override that evidence with paperwork that painted him as a confused old man, unable to make rational decisions. The quality of his work would be irrelevant if the court had already decided he lacked the capacity to choose his own living situation. Maybe you should just talk to them, Rose suggested gently. Show them what you've built. Explain why this matters to you. They're your children. Surely they want what's best for you. But Elias had learned that wanting what's best for someone wasn't the same as understanding what was actually best for them. David and Sarah wanted him safe and supervised, cared for by professionals in a controlled environment where variables could be managed and emergencies could be handled by trained staff. They couldn't see that the safety they offered was also a kind of death, the slow dissolution of purpose, and autonomy that killed the spirit long before it touched the body. Jake had spent Sunday afternoon documenting their work with a camera borrowed from Tom Brennan, creating a visual record of the project's scope and sophistication. The photographs would serve as evidence that Elias was capable of complex planning and skilled execution. But they also captured something more important, the obvious pride and satisfaction of a man engaged in meaningful work. These pictures tell a story, Jake observed while reviewing the images. Story of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and why he's doing it. Not to argue with evidence like this, but evidence and legal reality didn't always align, especially when family dynamics and institutional bias came into play. The psychiatric evaluation had been conducted without ever examining the subject, based entirely on the concerns of family members who'd already decided what conclusion they wanted to reach. It was professional-looking pseudoscience designed to provide legal cover for decisions that had already been made. As Sunday evening approached, Elias found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt since his army days, the strange combination of calm and alertness that came before important battles. His hands were steady as he made final adjustments to the workshop's layout, but his mind was running through scenarios and contingencies like a general preparing for siege warfare. The completed workshop was undeniably impressive. Tool racks held everything from traditional hand tools to modern power equipment, all organized with the precision of a man who understood that efficiency came from intelligent systems rather than expensive gadgets. The library section contained reference books on everything from wilderness medicine to advanced construction techniques, along with detailed journals documenting his restoration of the cabin and plans for future improvements. Most importantly, the workshop contained Margaret's letter, carefully preserved in a glass frame where it could be easily seen and read. Her final words about finding mountains and building. Something beautiful served as both inspiration and justification for everything Elias had accomplished. In his weeks of mountain exile, they're going to have a hard time arguing you're incompetent. When they see this place, Jake said, gathering his tools as evening shadows lengthened across the clearing. This is the work of a man who's thinking clearly about his future. But Elias knew that competence and autonomy weren't always about objective demonstration. They were about power, dynamics and institutional inertia, and the tendency of systems to protect themselves rather than the people they claimed to serve. His children had invested too much emotional energy and professional credibility in their diagnosis of his declining capacity to abandon it easily. Regardless of evidence to the contrary, still, he'd done what he could in the time available. The cabin and workshop complex now represented a comprehensive vision of sustainable mountain living, designed and built by a man who clearly understood both the challenges and opportunities of high-altitude self-sufficiency. If that wasn't enough to prove his competence, then competence wasn't really what this fight was about. Tom Patterson arrived as Jake was preparing to hike back down to the valley, bringing final updates on the legal situation and a promise to be present when Monday's confrontation took place. The sheriff's expression was grim but determined, suggesting he'd made his own decision about where his loyalties lay when law and justice pointed in different directions. Court order's been signed, Patterson reported. They'll be here tomorrow morning with authority to transport you for psychiatric evaluation, whether you consent or not. After that, it's up to a judge to decide if you're competent to make your own decisions, and if the judge decides I'm not, then you become a ward of the state or your children's custody, and this place gets sold to pay for your institutional care. The weight of those words settled over the clearing like evening mist. Everything Elias had built, the restored cabin, the innovative workshop, the carefully planned systems for mountain self-sufficiency, could be swept away by a single judicial decision based on psychiatric evaluation he'd never consented to undergo. But as he looked around at the work of the past 6 weeks, Elias felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with legal outcomes or family approval. He'd proven something important to himself, even if he couldn't prove it to the satisfaction of others. He demonstrated that an old man could still build something beautiful in a hard place. That experience and determination could overcome physical limitations and institutional skepticism. Tomorrow would bring his children and their lawyers and their court orders. But tonight, The mountain was his, and the work he'd done here was real, regardless of whether anyone else understood its value. Sometimes that had to be enough, the knowledge that you'd used your time well and built something that honored both your own vision and the memory of those who trusted you to find your own way. The iron hinges gleamed in the lantern light, Samuel Garrett's craftsmanship supporting Elias's vision across the span of nearly a century. Some things endured not because institutions protected them, but because they were built well enough to protect themselves. The sound of vehicles struggling up the mountain road reached Elias at dawn, their engines laboring against the steep grade and loose gravel that had never been designed for multiple cars, making the journey in convoy. He stood on his completed porch with Margaret's wooden cross in his hand, running his thumb across its smooth surface, the way she used to do during moments of uncertainty or prayer. Boone had positioned himself at the edge of the clearing, alert but not aggressive, understanding that today would bring changes he couldn't control, but determined to face them beside his master. The dog's presence was steadying, a reminder that loyalty didn't require explanations or justifications. It simply was. Sheriff Patterson arrived first. His patrol car, followed by a white van marked Mountain Medical Transport, and 2 SUVs with Denver license plates. The convoy parked in the meadow below the cabin, and Elias watched as his children emerged from the lead SUV with the careful movements of people preparing for an unpleasant but necessary task. David looked older than his 52 years, his face drawn with the kind of stress that came from making decisions you weren't entirely comfortable with. Sarah appeared equally tense, her usual composure replaced by the brittle determination of someone who'd convinced herself she was doing the right thing despite mounting evidence to the contrary. They were accompanied by 3 strangers who radiated professional competence, a woman in medical scrubs who must be the psychiatric evaluation specialist, and 2 men in expensive suits who had the predatory alertness of lawyers prepared for battle. The medical transport team remained with their vehicle, but their presence was a clear statement about how this encounter was expected to end. Jesus Christ. Dad, David breathed as the group climbed toward the cabin, his eyes taking in the transformation that had occurred over the past 6 weeks. What have you done up here? The cabin and workshop complex spread before them like a vision of mountain self-sufficiency that none of them had expected to find. Every detail spoke of careful planning and skilled execution, from the precisely fitted log walls to the ingeniously designed solar power system. This wasn't the desperate refuge of a confused old man. This was the accomplished work of someone who understood exactly what he was building and why. Built myself a home, Elias replied simply, still holding Margaret's cross, but keeping his voice calm and measured. Same as any man has a right to do. Dr. Rebecca Winters, the psychiatric specialist, had been studying the scene with the clinical attention of someone trained to assess mental competence through environmental observation. The obvious sophistication of the building project clearly wasn't fitting her preconceived expectations about a man suffering from dementia and paranoid delusions. Mr. Morrow, she said, approaching with the careful tone medical professionals used with potentially unstable patients. I'm Dr. Winters. Your children have asked me to conduct a preliminary assessment of your current mental state and living situation. Without my consent, Elias pointed out, tucking Margaret's cross into his shirt pocket, based on a report written by a doctor who never met me. The words hung in the mountain air like a challenge, and Elias saw Dr. Winters glance sharply at David and Sarah. Clearly, some aspects of this situation hadn't been fully explained to the medical professional they'd brought to validate their concerns. Sheriff Patterson stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sunlight as he moved between the family members and the medical team. Before we go any further, I think everyone needs to see what Mr. Morrow has accomplished up here. Might change some perspectives on his mental competence. The guided tour that followed was unlike anything the visitors had expected. Elias led them through the cabin and workshop complex with quiet pride, explaining the engineering solutions he'd developed for mountain living and the traditional techniques he'd combined with modern materials. Every system demonstrated forethought and technical competence, from the rainwater collection setup to the root cellars carved into the hillside. Jake Peterson had arrived during the tour, ostensibly to continue work on the project, but actually to serve as witness to whatever transpired. His presence added credibility to Elias's accomplishments. Here was a professional carpenter who could verify the quality and sophistication of the work that had been completed. This is master-level craftsmanship, Jake told the group while examining the workshop's tool organization and project documentation. It takes years of experience and careful planning to create systems this comprehensive. This isn't the work of someone with diminished mental capacity, but the lawyers weren't interested in craftsmanship assessments or witness testimony. They'd come prepared with court orders and legal authority that didn't depend on objective evaluation of Elias's competence. The lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Morrison, had been reviewing paperwork while the others toured the facilities. Impressive work, Morrison acknowledged when the group reassembled on the cabin's porch. But the court's concern isn't about building skills. It's about judgment, safety, and the ability to make rational decisions about medical care and living arrangements. He held up the court order like a weapon, its official seal and judicial signature carrying more weight than all the evidence of competent craftsmanship surrounding them. Mr. Morrow, you're required to submit to psychiatric evaluation to determine your fitness to live independently. Failure to comply will result in your immediate transport for involuntary assessment. The moment Elias had been preparing for had finally arrived, and with it the choice that would determine how the rest of his life would unfold. Elias walked slowly to his workbench and picked up the manila envelope that had changed everything, its contents now his most powerful weapon against the legal machinery arrayed against him. The morning sun slanted through the workshop windows, illuminating the glass frame where Margaret's letter waited to deliver its devastating testimony about what she truly wanted for her husband's life. Before you make any decisions about my competence, Elias said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd found his ground and intended to hold it. There's something you need to read. He handed Margaret's letter to David, watching his son's face change as he recognized their mother's handwriting. Sarah moved closer, reading over her brother's shoulder, and Elias saw the exact moment when they understood what they were looking at, their mother's final wishes, hidden in medical files they'd used to justify overriding their father's choices. She wrote this? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her carefully constructed certainty crumbling as she read Margaret's explicit support for the mountain life her husband was trying to build. When? 2 weeks before she died, Elias replied. While you were busy planning my future, she was trying to protect it. Dr. Winters had moved closer, her clinical detachment replaced by genuine interest as she observed the family dynamics playing out before her. The psychiatric evaluation she'd been asked to conduct was beginning to look less like objective medical assessment and more like the resolution of a family conflict that had nothing to do with mental competence. David's hands shook as he read their mother's words about independence and authenticity, about the importance of letting Elias find his own path, even if it frightened his children. The lawyer Morrison tried to interrupt, pointing out that dying wishes weren't legally binding when safety concerns were involved. But Sarah silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Dad," she said, tears starting in her eyes, "we didn't know. We thought after Mom died you seemed so lost, so isolated. We were scared you'd—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence that had driven their intervention. Scared I'd what? Choose to die in the place I loved, instead of wasting away in some institutional waiting room. Elias' voice was gentle but firm. That's exactly what your mother wanted me to do. Sheriff Patterson had been watching the exchange with the careful attention of a man who understood that legal authority sometimes had to yield to human truth. The court order in Morrison's hand was still valid. But the moral foundation supporting it was eroding with each word of Margaret's letter. "There's more," Elias continued, pulling out the psychiatric evaluation that had been conducted without his knowledge or consent. "Dr. Hoffman never examined me. This entire assessment is based on your concerns and assumptions, not on any actual evidence of diminished capacity." Dr. Winters took the file and reviewed it with growing professional dismay. An evaluation conducted without patient contact violated basic standards of psychiatric practice, especially when used to support involuntary commitment proceedings. Her credibility as a medical professional was now connected to correcting this ethical breach rather than perpetuating it. "This is highly irregular," she said finally. "Addressing Morrison and the Morrow children, I can't support legal action based on an assessment that doesn't meet professional standards. Mr. Morrow clearly demonstrates cognitive competence and sophisticated planning ability." The lawyer tried one final gambit, arguing that living alone at high altitude posed inherent risks that justified intervention regardless of mental competence. But Jake Peterson stepped forward with the documentation they'd prepared over the weekend: emergency communication systems, medical supply caches, detailed safety protocols that addressed every reasonable concern about mountain living. "He's better prepared for emergencies than most people living in town," Jake testified. "Solar power, battery backup, satellite radio for emergencies, and neighbors who check on each other regularly. This isn't isolation, it's community." The tide of the confrontation had turned completely. What had begun as a legal intervention to protect an incompetent elderly man had become an uncomfortable reckoning with family assumptions and professional overreach. The evidence of Elias's competence was overwhelming, and Margaret's letter provided moral authority that trumped legal technicalities. David was the first to break, sitting heavily on the porch steps and burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry, Dad. We thought we were protecting you, but we were just—" He looked up at the cabin and workshop complex, really seeing it for the first time. "This is incredible. You built all this? With some help from friends," Elias replied, including Jake and Sheriff Patterson in his gesture. "Turns out there are still people who understand that a man's worth isn't measured by how safely he's supervised." Morrison made one last attempt to salvage the legal proceeding, but Dr. Winters had already torn up her preliminary assessment and was preparing to file a report recommending that Elias remain in his chosen living situation. The medical transport team, seeing which way the wind was blowing, had begun packing their equipment. The battle for Elias Morrow's independence was over. Won not through legal maneuvering, but through the simple presentation of truth about his competence, his late wife's wishes, and his right to choose a meaningful life over a merely safe one. 3 months later, as the first serious snow of winter settled over the high country, Elias sat on his covered porch, watching Sarah's children build a snowman in the clearing, where legal papers and family conflict had once threatened to tear his new life apart. The old photograph from his wallet lay open on the table beside him, not hidden away this time, but displayed alongside newer pictures that told the story of healing and reconciliation. The wooden wind vane Samuel Garrett had crafted spun lazily in the gentle snowfall, its copper elk still catching what light filtered through the overcast sky. The artifact had become a symbol of continuity, connecting past and present, honoring both the original builder's vision and the restoration that had given it new purpose. Below, David was teaching his teenage son how to split kindling with proper technique, passing down skills his own father had tried to teach him decades ago. "You were right, Dad," Sarah had said during their first real conversation after the confrontation, her voice carrying the weight of genuine understanding. "We were so afraid of losing you that we almost lost who you really are." The apology had meant everything, not because Elias needed vindication, but because it represented his children's willingness to see him as a complete person rather than a problem to be managed. They'd spent the autumn months rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of respect rather than control. learning to appreciate the life he'd created instead of fearing the risks it might entail. David visited most weekends now, bringing his family and often staying to help with projects around the expanding homestead. His corporate job had begun to seem less important than the time spent working with his hands alongside his father, rediscovering skills and satisfactions he'd forgotten existed. The pressed shirts and acronym-heavy meetings felt increasingly distant when measured against the immediate pleasure of building something useful and beautiful. Sarah had been slower to embrace the mountain life, but she'd found her own connection through the gardens she'd helped establish around the cabin. Her knowledge of plants and landscaping had transformed the clearing into something that honored both the wild mountain setting and the human presence within it. Wildflowers bloomed where legal documents had once scattered in the wind. The medical transport team and lawyers had long since returned to Denver, their services no longer required once the family had worked out their differences without institutional intervention. Dr. Winters had filed a comprehensive report documenting Elias's competence and the ethical problems with the original psychiatric evaluation, effectively closing any possibility of future legal challenges to his